Hi, everyone. It is just exactly 6 o'clock. I'm going to wait another minute or so for people to trickle into the virtual room, and then we'll get started. And we've got people, let's see, in the chat. Ooh, Washington Heights. Oh, Washington Heights librarian with New York Public Library years ago and used Perez and Martina often. Pura Belpre was a superhero. Oh, nice. We've got people from Fredonia, Troy, Schenectady, Vestal. Great. I'll give people just one more minute. Oh, Will, the Carnahans are here.
I saw John in a Super Bowl commercial. I emailed Florence about that.
I heard.
Local commercial.
I didn't know he was such a celebrity. All right. Well, it's 6:02. I don't want to keep people waiting too long, so why don't we dive right in? Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual lecture series talking about Race Matters. Join the conversation. I'm Meredith Horsford. I'm the executive director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. Oh, the Carnahans are laughing. We are delighted to continue this series, which was very successful in August of 2020 when we first hosted it. This time we're doing a 6-week series during Black History Month, which started 2 weeks ago. And so far we've heard from Herbert Signoret discussing Seneca Village and Don Rice talking about Inwood's Dyckman Oval. We're continuing to share stories of New York's Black history each week with a different speaker. So race has been an important topic that influences our lives historically and clearly in the present, which is the reason that we began this series. We feel that it is important to facilitate these conversations with experts, even though sometimes they can be challenging. Each week, we will look at the topic of race from a different perspective, similar to the series that we did last August, when we heard from anthropologists, a historian, and an archaeologist. Our goal for the series has been to continue to encourage everyone to come together, learn from one another, and continue the conversation. Before we get started, just a few little housekeeping bits of information on Crowdcast, the platform that we're using. The chat box is on the right, which clearly people are finding. Feel free to say hello, let us know where you're joining us from. And if you have any technical assistance questions, you can ask them here in the chat, and Melissa, our Development and Community Engagement Manager, will be able to help you. During the lecture, if you have questions for the speaker, there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom center of your screen, and we will either answer those questions during the talk or at the end. Also, just wanted to thank everyone for attending the event. We at the museum feel strongly that our programming remains free of charge so that they are accessible to all. The response to this lecture series has really been overwhelming, and there is clearly a need for us to talk more about the issues that divide us and the issues that unite us as Americans. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support our programs. This event has been made possible in part with a sponsorship from TD Bank. It has also been made possible in part by funding from the New York Community Trust, a Humanities New York Cares grant with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Federal CARES Act. We are grateful for their contributions, which have assisted in the continued success of this series. If you would like to make a donation to help us continue our community-focused programming, it is always greatly appreciated. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. You can locate the donate button at the bottom of your screen as well. We also want to announce, which we mentioned for the first time at last week's lecture, that we are selling a limited edition shirt that highlights the names of the enslaved and free people that lived and worked on the farmhouse. You can see it right here on the right of your screen next to Will. Melissa is also going to share the link in the chat. And you'll see that on the left picture on the front of the shirt, it says the names of the enslaved and free people who lived at the farmhouse. And on the right, which is the back of the shirt, it says, say their names. So please buy one for yourself, buy one for your friends, and feel free to share this with anyone that you think might be interested in supporting our cause. And please help us reach our goal of selling 300 shirts during this lecture series, which ends on Wednesday, March 10th. Proceeds will support further research and educational programming on the topic of the enslaved and free people highlighted on the t-shirt. So tonight we are joined by Dr. Will Walker, Associate Professor of History at the Cooperstown Graduate Program and SUNY Oneonta. Will Walker is the author of A Living Exhibition, The Smithsonian and the Transformation of the Universal Museum, and an editor of the Inclusive Historian's Handbook, which can be found at inclusivehistorian.com. He is an active public historian who oversees a long-term community oral history project and often facilitates community dialogue programs. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Will Walker, presenting Zora Neale Hurston and Pura Belpre, pioneers of Black and Latinx folk culture in Upper Manhattan.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. It's really an honor to be part of this series and to be connected with such a dynamic organization. We have a great partnership with the Cooperstown Graduate Program and the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. So I've gotten to see at close hand all the things that you're doing, and this is another one in a long string of great programs. I can't see any of you all. I can only see my slides, so I'm just going to trust that you're with me, and Meredith will let me know if there is an issue. So the research I'm going to share with you this evening is part of a larger book project on New York and folk culture in the 1930s. And the larger project focuses on the good work that key individuals, including Zora Neale Hurston and Pura Belpre, were able to do by sharing diverse folk cultural traditions in New York, not just the city, but in fact the whole state. And it offers a reframing of New York's role in the first phase of the larger U.S. folk revival, or what is sometimes called the folk Renaissance. One of my main goals is to diversify this story and to show that New York's folk revival was truly multicultural. I want to say, though, that this is very much a work in progress, still in the early stages. And so I'm looking forward to your questions, your comments, your feedback, your suggestions for further research, and perhaps some of you even have connections with Pura Belpre that you'd be willing to share. So despite the order of my title, I'm going to start with Pura Belpre. Almost everyone, I hope, has heard of Zora Neale Hurston, at least since her rediscovery in the 1970s. But very few people outside of New York's Puerto Rican community have heard of Pura Belpre. And this is a shame, because she was just as significant a figure as Hurston. So I'm going to begin with her, partly because she came to New York City a few years before Hurston, so chronologically it makes sense, and partly because I want to make sure you know who she was. According to the literary scholar and Belpre biographer Lisa Sanchez Gonzalez, Pura Belpre is, in many striking ways, the Zora Neale Hurston of Boricua literary history, with a flamboyant polyglot twist. So who was Pura Belpre? She was the first Puerto Rican librarian in the New York Public Library system. She started in the system in 1921. She was the author of the first major bilingual Hispanic Latinx children's book in the United States, Perez and Martina, which was published in 1932. She was a storyteller, a puppeteer, and the author of several books of Puerto Rican and Hispanic Latinx folktales. And she was a key figure in bringing Puerto Rican and Hispanic Latinx culture to New York and the mainland United States. And finally, she was a major proponent of bilingual education and bilingual literature. To give you some biographical information about Belpre, so you understand her background a little more, she was born in 1899 in Sidra, Puerto Rico, which is near Cayey. She lived in Cayey and then moved to Arroyo and Guayama, and then eventually to San Juan. In 1919, she graduated from high school in San Juan, and began studies at the University of Puerto Rico. In 1921, she interrupted her studies to go to New York City for her sister Elisa's wedding, and she decided to stay. And that same year, she was hired by the New York Public Library's 135th Street branch. She was hired because the leaders of that library thought that the area, the community around the library was developing a Spanish-speaking population. They were actually incorrect in that. That didn't eventually happen. The area around there became much more of an African-American neighborhood. But that is the reason they hired Belpre originally, because they wanted someone who could speak Spanish and communicate with this population. In 1926, she studied at the New York Public Library School, and a storytelling course there led to the first telling of the story Perez and Martina, which I'll talk more about in a moment. In 1926, she moved from 135th Street downtown, way downtown, to the Seward Park branch in the Lower East Side, and there she was in charge of storytelling. And she was also exposed there to a much different community. It was a predominantly Jewish community, and so she was immersed in a very different cultural milieu. Then in 1929, she moves back uptown, this time to the 115th Street branch, which is now the Harry Belafonte Library. I want to, before proceeding with the rest of Belpre's story, I want to take a brief detour to tell you what drew me to her story. I'm not going to provide too much family background on myself, but I do want to say that her story, I was drawn to her story because it's very similar to my great-grandmother's story. My great-grandmother, Alice Carril, or Alicia Rivera Carril, was born in Cayey in 1904. And just like Belpre, she moved to San Juan when she was 16, went to high school there, and then to New York City in the early 1920s. And there she met my great-grandfather, who was from Spain. He was from Galicia, the north of Spain. And they were married. You could see their wedding picture there. And then the picture on the right is my sister when she was 9 or 10 years old, my mom, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother. So I feel very connected to Belpre's story because it's very similar to my great-grandmother's story. So let's talk about Perez and Martina. This is perhaps what Belpre is best known for and remembered for, this wonderful book and this wonderful story. It was published in 1932 by Frederick Warren and Co., which was a major publisher, was the publisher of Beatrix Potter's work. So this was a significant publishing company issuing a major work. You can see here is the title page. It's brilliantly illustrated. It's just a beautiful book. And the story, which I would encourage you to look up and read yourself, and perhaps you can even find a recording of Belpre herself reading this story, because those do exist, is a courtship tale. So various suitors come to court Martina, the cockroach. You can see here Senor Frog, and she rejects them all until the mouse Perez comes, and she is charmed by him. And sadly, it has a tragic ending. I won't give it away, but it does have a sad ending, as do many classic fairy tales. This page I want to draw your attention to at the beginning of the book, because it shows that Belpre herself is saying that this came from oral tradition, right? That she was drawing on a story that her grandmother had told her. The story runs from mouth to mouth, but has never been published. The story is told here in the way it came down to me from my grandmother. I thought that was a beautiful way to put it. Later, much later in her life, Belpre framed the source of her stories this way, in a very compelling way. She said, "My grandmother had told them to me, stories that kept wonder alive in me, even in New York. These stories mixed the thoughts of the Taino Indians of Puerto Rico, who were cut down when the Spanish came, of the conquistadores, who brought with them the Arab stories they remembered long after they had expelled the Arabs from Spain, of the West Africans brought to the island by the Spanish to work the fields when the Indians disappeared. The stories were like kisses from my grandmother, and I loved them because when I heard them, my mind was nothing but pictures." So really, speaking to the inherently multicultural roots of Latinx folk culture, right? That it's this mixture of indigenous and European and African, and even in this case, Middle Eastern, Arab. You can see one more page from the book here, just to show you that it was integrally bilingual. In most cases, most of the text is English, but with phrases inserted here or there. But here we have a pivotal moment in the text when Perez is introducing himself, and the Spanish text is privileged, right? This fine gentleman is presenting himself. So it's a wonderful, important book, but I want to add to this a bit about the work that Belpre was doing in the community, not only in libraries, but in the area, the communities around the library, because her work was never confined just to writing and publishing. She was very much engaged in library work and in community work, and all of these things came together. She was doing this work not only in English but in Spanish as well. So she was doing all kinds of bilingual work, starting in the 1920s, but really flowering in the 1930s and the early 40s. And a lot of this work was happening in Harlem, in what she called Southwest Harlem, and then in El Barrio. The kind of culmination of this, in a way, was the creation of the first celebration of Three Kings Day, or La Fiesta de Reyes, or La Fiesta de los Reyes Magos, at the 115th Street branch, which is also where she introduced puppetry, which becomes critical to her practice, central to her practice as well. In the late 30s, she moved across town to the Hamilton Grange branch very briefly, and then comes back, I think around 1940, to the Aguilar branch, which is right in El Barrio. And she kept doing the Three Kings Day celebration there. It followed her to Aguilar. This is how Belpre described the work that they were doing, that she and her colleagues were doing at the time, in particular at the 115th Street branch. She wrote in an essay called Bilingual Storyteller that the first group that began to visit the children's room were grandmothers in search of cartillas, the Spanish ABC, to teach their grandchildren Spanish, afraid that they would forget it. She writes that this was a growing community settling its roots in Southwest Harlem. They were actually developing a church at the time. She writes, the first Spanish church of the Puerto Rican community, La Milagrosa. And she writes about how there was an important bilingual exchange happening here, where teachers exchanged English for Spanish with the priests to better serve the Spanish-speaking students. Spanish story hours were held at the church. There was a reading club for teenagers. You used the Spanish book collection. And there was a bilingual picture book hour that they held, as she writes, on the roof of the Hebrew Y at 110th Street and 5th Avenue overlooking Central Park. So you get the sense that this was work that was not just isolated in the library, that this was touching the whole community there, which is a growing and developing community. Some of the places she mentions, this is the 115th Street branch, obviously a much more contemporary photograph. This is the La Milagrosa Church, the full name of which was the Church of Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal, Iglesia de Nuestra Señora de la Milagrosa. And it was, interestingly, it was a synagogue, as she says. And in the late 20s, it was sold to the Vicentians and turned into this Roman Catholic church. And now, in 1980, it was sold to the Mount Nebo Baptist Church, which continues to occupy it, which is a predominantly African-American congregation. Another organization or institution that Belpre connected with in this time was Casita Maria, which was a community center, a Puerto Rican community center, and still is not in this location anymore. Interestingly, I'd be curious if anyone knows of a place where I could find, and perhaps Casita Maria is the place to find other photographs from that time period. This photo came from the collections, the Pura Belpre papers in the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and it is identified as being in Casita Maria, but I'd love to have other photographs to corroborate that. These are some of the locations of Casita Maria in the 30s. You can see it was on East 113th Street, then 110th Street, then 107th, and eventually in the 1960s moved to the South Bronx, where it remains today, doing a lot of the same work. I want to circle back to something that I mentioned earlier, and other than Perez and Martina, this is probably the other thing that people who know Pura Belpre know about her, is that she was involved in the founding, I guess, of this community celebration of Three Kings, the Three Kings Day. In my research, it appears that the first celebration occurred in 1938, January 6th, 1938. This program is in the Pura Belpre papers, an invitation to Anne Carroll Moore, who was kind of the godmother of all of these wonderful librarians in the New York Public Library system at the time. She was the first supervisor of children's work in the New York Public Library. So this is an invitation to her and a program from the what I believe to be the first Three Kings Day celebration. I did find some mentions in La Prensa of earlier Three Kings Day celebrations that happened in social clubs, but they didn't seem to be kind of geared towards children and the whole community. But again, I'd be interested if folks have leads or evidence that they'd be willing to share with me. If you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see, but the program, one of the things that I think is significant is that you have a mixture of art forms happening here. So it's not just storytelling, it's music, right? It starts with La Borinqueña, then you have a story, you have carols, you have a dance, a puppet show, so it's really a holistic celebration, right? It's a fully integrated performance. It's not just one thing. And that's something that will come back when we get to Zora Neale Hurston as a characteristic of her work as well. I don't know much about the other folks here. I do know that Maria Simino was Belpre's colleague. She was the children's librarian before Belpre, and they did collaborate quite a bit. She was of Italian descent. And I know because Belpre mentions it that she worked with Lola Bravo, who was a renowned flamenco teacher on this program, although she's not mentioned in the program that you see here. Belpre published her Three Kings story, The Three Magi, in 1944 in a book called The Animals' Christmas. It was an edited collection, beautiful edited collection of Christmas stories. And you can see here as well that it was bilingual. The text itself is entirely English, but the epigraph and then at the end, the beautiful poem about all good children will rejoice, both in Spanish and English, in this original publication in 1944. I want to jump briefly out of chronology, just to connect to the more contemporary celebrations of Three Kings Day in the city. Of course, El Museo del Barrio plays a critical role here in organizing the parade and the celebration. And Belpre continued to be involved. This is a program from El Museo del Barrio in 1973-74, their Christmas exhibition, and they had an illustrated slide series of the story of the Three Magi, as well as Santos and silkscreen posters. Sounds like a great exhibition. And this is a program from the same year, from 74, from the Dia de los Reyes festival at Lincoln Center, which El Museo was also involved in. You can see there. And then, of course, this tradition continues. This is my screenshot from this year's virtual celebration, which you may still be able to find, I think, on El Museo's website. It's wonderful. I would encourage everyone to check it out. They did a great job with that. And hopefully next year it will be back in person. And back to Belpre's chronology. In the early 40s, she read a paper at the American Library Association meeting in Cincinnati, Ohio, and met the composer Clarence Cameron White, who was a well-known African-American composer and concert violinist. And they married in 1943, and Belpre decided to leave her job at the New York Public Library. But she continued to write, she continued to publish, she continued to do storytelling programs. She was involved in some very interesting collaborations with classical musicians in this time period. One of the books she published in this time was The Tiger and the Rabbit and Other Tales, which contains many of the stories that she likely told and developed in the 1930s, including Juan Bobo, which is the story of a character who's not so smart, but it's also smart and crafty in surprising ways. So there are many Juan Bobo stories, including this one in The Tiger and the Rabbit. Okay. The final phase of Belpre's career, after Clarence Cameron White dies, she comes back to the New York Public Library and becomes the Spanish children's specialist in the Office of Children's Services, continues to write and publish. It works with something called the South Bronx Library Project, which is an amazing project of bilingual education and bilingual literature. Continues to do other programs, as you can see there in the image, all the way up until she passes away in 1982. There's an organization now in the city that is carrying on Belpre's legacy. Teatro Sea has a Pura Belpre project, which I wanted to make sure to give a shout out to. I discovered it through El Museo's Three Kings Day celebration this year, and they did a Facebook Live event. It was really wonderful. So I encourage you to visit their website and Facebook page to learn more about the Pura Belpre project. And then finally, to wrap up Belpre, I just want to reiterate, why does her work matter, right? Especially if we're thinking about this larger reassessment or reimagination of New York's folk renaissance. Well, first and foremost, she championed bilingual education and bilingual literature at a time when there were not many people doing that. And there was quite a bit of pressure going the other way, right? She encouraged cultural pride among Puerto Ricans and other Hispanic, Latinx New Yorkers and Americans. She celebrated diversity and multiculturalism, and she pushed back against assimilation, stereotypes, and racism throughout her career. And for these reasons and others, I would argue that Pura Belpre should be considered a central figure in New York's folk renaissance of the 1930s. Of course, another figure who should be central to this story is Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston, of course, was a key figure of the Harlem Renaissance, a writer, folklorist, and cultural impresario. She was the author of many novels, short stories, essays, and plays. She was best known for her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and folklore collection, Mules and Men, which were published in 1937 and 1935, respectively. Her writing was rediscovered in the 1970s, largely due to the efforts of the writer Alice Walker, and subsequently it has assumed its rightful place in American literary history. I'm not going to give as much biographical detail about Hurston as I gave about Belpre, because many of the details of her life are fairly well known or easily accessible on the internet, but I would encourage you to look into her life further. It is fascinating. But I want to focus in, as I did with Belpre, on the importance of folk culture, the ways that Hurston utilized folk culture in her artistic work to do good work in society, right? So she incorporated Black folk culture into much of her work. This is widely recognized by literary scholars. It was, the source not only for her scholarly work as a folklorist, her nonfiction work, but also for her fictional work. It was the well that she drew on continually throughout her career to produce these remarkable creative works. However, one of the things that continues to be under-recognized about Hurston is that she utilized folk culture not only in her writing, but in numerous theatrical productions. So there was this public-facing element to her work that was directly engaging with audiences in New York City and far beyond New York City as well. A key goal of these productions was to counter negative stereotypes of Black people and to provide much richer and more accurate portrayals of Black life. So a little bit about Hurston's New York City timeline, because she lived in various places and worked in various places, but she did spend several years in New York City and did a great deal of her formative work there. She was born actually in Alabama, but really grew up in Eatonville, Florida, which, if you've read her novels, if you've read any of her work, you know what a large role this place plays in all of her work. It was an all-Black community that had just a rich and supportive environment for Hurston and others. In the early 20s, she is able to study at Howard University. And then in January 1925, she moves to New York City and quickly becomes, a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. In September 1925, she enters Barnard College and studies with the famous anthropologist Franz Boas, who was the father of cultural relativism. Right? In the late 20s, she conducted fieldwork in quite a few places in Florida and Louisiana and the Bahamas. So she wasn't always in the city, but her home base in this time was still New York City. And in May 1928, she earned her BA from Barnard. In the early 1930s, she worked on several theatrical productions in New York City. So she's doing all this field work. She's writing up this research. She's writing what would become Mules and Men, but she's also working on these important, these theatrical productions. After those kind of come to fruition, at least partly, she leaves New York City, returns to Florida, and only comes back to the city for brief periods. However, in 1935, she did begin doctoral study at Columbia, but did not complete it. These were her various residences in New York City in the 1920s and early 1930s. I'm relying on the historian Carla Kaplan here, who has published Hurston's edited letters. If you poke around on the internet, you find some other places that say that Zora Neale Hurston lived here. And that may be the case, but these are the locations that were listed in Kaplan's work. So let's talk a little bit about her involvement with the theater. It actually starts pretty early in her life. After she leaves Florida, she tours for a time, about a year to a year and a half, with a traveling Gilbert and Sullivan troupe as a lady's maid for one of the actors. And she falls in love with the theater, and she gets a tremendous exposure to all elements of theatrical work. While she was at Howard, she was involved with the Howard Players, and she subsequently wrote a number of plays, at least 11 plays. She famously collaborated in the early 1930s, some of you may know about this controversy, with Langston Hughes, who at the time was her good friend, on a project called Mulebone, which was a play that they were working on together. Unfortunately, it has a sad ending because their friendship fell apart over creative disputes around this project, specifically a dispute over authorship. It appears that Hurston really wrote most of it, and Hughes may have been trying to claim a little more credit than he was due. Also in the early 30s, Hurston was involved with two African-American revues in New York City. One called Fast and Furious, and another called Jungle Scandals. And finally, in 1931-32, she mounted her own review, which I'll talk more about in a moment, called The Great Day, or From Sun to Sun. It was really the experience of doing those two African-American reviews that motivated Hurston to kind of mount her own show. It was her dissatisfaction, really, with those reviews. She didn't have kind things to say about her collaborators. This is from a letter that she wrote to her patron about the experience on Fast and Furious, that the person in charge squeezed all Negroness out of everything and substituted what he thought ought to be Negro humor. So suggestive that there's kind of a stereotyping that's going on here that wasn't true to authentic Black culture, African-American culture. And she responded in the same letter by saying, I'm planning a concert of the most intensely Black type. So I'm going to do a review of the real thing, the real deal. And that's exactly what she did. She mounted a program of original Negro folklore, as she called it. This is the program here at the John Golden Theater, which at the time was at 58th Street between Broadway and 7th Avenue. The current John Golden Theater is in a different location. I had to look that up. And one of the things to notice about this program is the incredible diversity of the content. So you have work songs. It starts with work songs. It's all set in a camp, a work camp, and it's a day in the life, basically, of the people in this camp. And so it starts with work songs and hollers, and you get spirituals, and you get blues and other songs, and you get party music. You also get children's games and a sermon and dancing. And the dancing comes from the Bahamas. Actually, this was material that Hurston had collected when she was doing fieldwork. She actually filmed this fire dance in the Bahamas and then reproduced it as part of this show. You can also see listed that there was a planned conjure ceremony. Hurston did really intense research on the conjuremen of Louisiana. But ultimately, that piece was not included in the performance. It was in the program, but it was not included in the performance. And there's discussion as to why that happened, but it was not in the show. So all this material came from her own personal experiences growing up in Florida, growing up in Eatonville, being immersed in this culture, and then also her thorough field research, which was diasporic, which was not just limited to kind of her home, but really surveyed several different parts of the African diaspora. This is the one image from the show. It's not actually from the performance. It's from a rehearsal of the dancers from the fire dance, not all of whom were actually Bahamian. It was a mixture of Bahamians and African Americans. But these are the dancers who performed in The Great Day. So this show had its premiere at the John Golden Theater, January 10th, 1932, as I said. Sadly, it was a critical success. It was a critical success, but sadly, it was not a financial success. So it didn't have a run. It didn't continue in that theater. Hurston was able to mount another version of the show retitled From Sun to Sun at the New School a couple of months later in March. And then April after that, the dancers who did the Bahamian dances, dance material performed at a cabaret at the Vanderbilt Hotel. But the show continued. Hurston really believed in it and continued to mount this even while she was working on her novels and her other work. She, in Florida, collaborated with Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, to do several performances. She was also asked to present excerpts at the first National Folk Festival in St. Louis, which was this, incredibly diverse, multicultural folk festival in St. Louis. She did a version of the show in Chicago in 1934, and then again in 1938 presented excerpts at the 5th National Folk Festival in Washington, D.C. So even though the show did not have a run on Broadway, it did reach a lot of people over the decade of the 1930s. So why did Hurston's work with folk culture matter? Well, first of all, it combined various examples of Black culture: stories, sermons, songs, and dancing, right? Again, like the Three Kings Day celebration, like Belpre's work, it was holistic. It wasn't just about the stories. It wasn't just about the songs. It was about bringing all of these pieces together, right? It was based on deep personal experience and thorough field research. So she was very much an insider in the culture that she was sharing, but then also there were times that she was an outsider. She was coming to the Bahamas or to Haiti as an outsider, had to learn about the culture. Her work, and I would argue all of her work, but her theatrical work is so important because it countered stereotype depictions of Black culture in popular U.S. media and presented a remarkably rich portrait of Black life. If you think about the history of representations of African American culture on the stage, it's so bound up with minstrelsy and blackface and all of these horrible stereotypes. And what Hurston was able to do was to present a totally different, much more real and rich portrait of Black culture and Black life. And then finally, as I mentioned, it incorporated a diasporic perspective, right? So she was reaching out and including diverse Black cultures, right? Not just a singular African American culture. All right. So in conclusion, circle back to where I started with this larger project, which again, I'll say again, is very much in the early stages. I think we need a major reframing of New York's folk Renaissance, right? Look at these photographs here. You see kind of the key players, the key figures, the forefathers, if you will, of New York's folk revival, right? Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Alan Lomax, and Hughie Ledbetter or Leadbelly, right? Without taking anything away from their significance, I would argue that we need to revise the story, particularly of the first phase of the revival in the 1930s, or the folk Renaissance. It was much more diverse and multicultural than scholars have shown. Women played a central role, and women's roles have clearly been significantly underrepresented. And it was about more than just songs. New York's folk Renaissance was diverse in several ways, in terms of race and ethnicity, as well as gender. In addition, in terms of the art forms, they were much more holistic than we think. Songs, stories, dance, and even crafts were intertwined and often presented together. And with that, I will stop and happily take any questions that you have. Here are some suggested resources. I owe a great debt to all of these scholars, Lisa Sanchez-Gonzalez and her pathbreaking work on Belpre's biography and her literature, Valerie Boyd and her biography of Hurston, Carla Kaplan, And another scholar, Anthea Kraut, who has done incredible work documenting performances of the Bahamian fire dance and that piece of the Great Day story. So, and there's my contact information. So feel free to email me.
Thanks, Will. All right, so I'm going to dive into some of these questions that we've got here for you.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question, Will, is can you recommend or share any live press clips or videos of Belpre and Hurston speaking about their work?
Not, I don't have them queued up in my tabs. The Center for Puerto Rican Studies has produced a wonderful documentary on Pura Belpre, which includes examples of her storytelling. So I would recommend that you check out that documentary. I have not come across Hurston material. I'm sure it's out there. But because Belpre, her career carried into the 60s and 70s, there's more footage of her. Most of it comes from that period. Yeah.
Okay. Another question is who illustrated Poora Belpre's book, the one that you showed? I think they're talking about Perez and Martina.
Yeah, I brought it. So I don't know much about the illustrator. I tried to look up the illustrator, Carlos Sanchez M. And I don't know what M stands for. So that if you have more information, I know that he illustrated at least one other book from the time, I'm sure many others. But I have not yet been able to find any information about the illustrator.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Someone else says, fantastic presentation as always, Will. I was wondering if you've happened to come upon any correlations between the Art Nouveau movement and Belpre's folk tales. I would be curious if any Latinx folk art was found.
I don't know. Maybe could they give an example of what work they're thinking of?
This was from someone named Elena. Maybe she could write something in the chat.
Okay. I'm trying to think of. I mean, certainly, maybe through the puppetry. You can sort of see. I've seen pictures of the puppets from later, and I'm assuming that they were similar to the puppets in the 30s. But yeah, it was, and I have to dig this out of my notes, but it was somebody who had taken a puppetry course at Juilliard who introduced Belpre to the art form. And she may have, several accounts say she took a puppetry class at Columbia. But I have to pursue that a little bit more to find out if she was doing that. But yeah, I'm very interested in other connections that she may have had in the kind of artistic world. Yeah. I know she's really embedded in this incredible network of librarians and community institutions. But, I haven't found a lot of the other people I'm looking at are sort of in this network. And Belpre seems to be I haven't found the strand that connects her to all the other things. I mean, thematically, she's so connected, but I haven't found that personal connection.
Okay. Oh, Elena just wrote in the chat. She said, I can't give any examples off the top of my head, but I know a lot of children's fairy tale books have Art Nouveau style. Thanks so much. I'd like to explore this more as a museum educator.
I brought The Animals Christmas, so I was able to find that. And I wouldn't necessarily describe it as Art Nouveau. I mean, it's got beautiful illustrations, but so this was illustrated by Valenti Angelo. And then this one, so I haven't gotten my hands on a first edition. This is actually from SUNY Oneonta's library. It's from the 60s, a reissue with illustrations by Tommy DePaola, who's, you know, the incredible illustrator of so many children's books.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, we've got another question in here. This person wants to know, did you read Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick? If so, what did you think?
I didn't. Tell me about
it. Well, you get to put that on your...
It rings a bell. Thank you for the suggestion. I'm trying to read as many books as I can. I've got a big stack.
I'm sure a lot to tackle.
I've definitely, it's ringing a bell, but sorry.
Okay. Well, you can add it to your long list.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that might be the last of our questions, unless anyone wants to throw one in here at the last minute. And yes, somebody wrote in here, asked if we would be able to view this later. Melissa will put the information a couple of times in the chat just so you can see how you can access the whole presentation later on if you joined us a little bit late. Okay, I think we've answered all of our questions. This was great, Will. Thank you so much. Great to learn more. As you mentioned, I mean, I already knew quite a bit about Zora Neale Hurston, but great to learn more about Poora Belpre. So thank you so much for joining us. So thanks everyone who joined us tonight. Also, please consider, making a donation to the museum if you enjoyed this program. Also, don't want to remind you that this is the third of our 6-week lecture series talking about race matters. Join the conversation. Join us here every Wednesday at 6 o'clock on Prep Crowdcast. Be sure to register through the links provided on our social media. And we'll see you here next week, February 24th at 6 p.m. for The Enslaved at Sylvester Manor, Revealing Their Stories Through Landscape and Memory by Donna Marie Barnes. Thanks so much and have a great evening. Thanks, Will.